I first met Marty that I can recall when I was about 3 years old at a ranch in San Diego. And what I remember about Marty from those very early years was that he had flaming orange hair. Now, he didn't have red hair, he had orange hair. And Uncle Red had orange hair, his pop. And Marty, from that time on, was always an interesting enigma for me, because even though we weren't close all the time, our homes were not very far apart in El Segundo, and I'd get to walk up and see what he and Pete were doing, Pete being Volney, his older brother, and see what they were doing and try to understand what the big boys were doing, because God knows I was a little boy at the time. And it was an interesting and an evolving life. So I lost kind of track of Marty, except intermittently when he was at Davis or Woodland or somewhere up north. And then he came into our life really, really big time in 1980. And in 1981, Marty helped Judy start Rail Delivery Services, which is the family business. He came from New York. He lived with us for a while. He went and found a guy that had started to develop mini computer, little bitty microcomputers. A guy named Stuart Ernest, who built a thing called the Stratos unit, which was a CP/M-based machine. And on that machine, he programmed a bunch of D-based stuff, and we were able to build things. And we were able to start to run a trucking company amidst incredibly difficult competition from the entrenched regulated carriers in California. So it was a big time, and Marty was a huge part of that. So that went on, and of course, like all software in the world, and those of you who understand software understand that it's an ever-evolving world. Things change all the time, and you have to change too. And so Marty hung around, and by the time he built that, it continued to need modifications and rewrites. And in 1997, he wrote the present software, which runs rail delivery to this day. Probably the most cutting-edge software in our business, all written in very old code, thousands and thousands of programs that are indecipherable to most people, except to Marty. He could actually balance all that stuff in his head. Now, if you want to look back at Marty, Marty graduated from high school in 1958. He and Bonnie is a fraternal sister. Bonnie was too ill to come today, but her daughters are here. Marty, in high school, he kind of liked the theater. And so, I forget who, I think it was Volney that said in his notes in your book that every time you got to see Marty and looked in his trunk, you found all these gels from his lighting stuff, and lights and cables. And in the old days, those things were huge, ungainly, very hard. The gels were little pieces of cellophane of different colors. And that was kind of how Marty lived his life. Ultimately, he kind of scrammed out of Southern California, went up to Northern California and started to get involved with lighting and doing stage managing and that kind of stuff. So that was sort of his first different love. Then Volney called. Then Pete called and said, "Come to Massachusetts, I have work for you to do." And Marty taught himself Fortran, he taught himself COBOL, he taught himself assembly language. It's the days of these freaking computers that, you had to use punch cards to program them. And so Marty would sit in the middle of the night after having spent the day doing surveys of consumers to find out what they would buy, eat, whatever. A lot of good stuff about that in Volney's right up in the handbook, the little memorabilia book we gave you. And he'd work all night programming cards, punching cards, throw them in, let the computers grind away at MIT or wherever he was working, NYU, whatever university he got time at. And then in the morning, he'd bring the data out, and Volney would look at it and conclude what he needed to conclude, go off and sell some more business. And and this is how Marty was his whole life. He was self-taught in everything he did. He never went to college. I mean, he did some time at El Camino, a community college, but really that was more to sort of flesh out his interests. It wasn't because he was so tremendously interested in education in and of itself. So my take on Marty was, starting in 1981, he gave of himself generously to Judy and I. He helped us build what is now a large company with lots of employees and a lot of business, and it couldn't have ever been done but for Marty. But he didn't care about that so much. He sort of cared about the people. And so the thing you'd always find with Marty would be, he's supposed to be working on something, and you'd find him down somewhere in the building talking to somebody about some obscure thing in their life and cataloging all those obscure things in their lives. And it wouldn't matter who the person was. Marty had absolutely no pretensions. He was about the least pretentious person that ever lived. I mean, Marty had clothes that were 40 years old. In fact, Judy actually had to force him to take his pants off because he had a rip in the crotch, and he said they were too comfortable. And Judy essentially ripped them off him and burned them. The next day I had to take him out to shop. Of course, I had to talk him into going to Target because he wanted to go to Kmart. So therein lies the essential genius of Martin Stefflre. We were blessed that all during the time Red Livery's been growing up over the last 36 years, Marty's lived largely with us. For the first 10 or so years, he split his time between New York, an apartment, a rent-controlled apartment in Manhattan, and with us. And then he lived with us essentially until he moved, bought a little place in Reno Valley, and had a place of his own again. So we were through, a decade ago, Marty had a three-way bypass. At that time, he was a walking dead man. So after the bypass, he had 3 lanes open, running at about 40%, 45%, and he never felt better. Judy nursed him to health. It took me 2 years almost to get him back up and running again, but then he gave us another decade, and we are all to be lucky for that. The last thing I'll say before I start to ask people to give me their thoughts is, I was there the morning before Marty passed away. And he'd gone into the hospital because he had didn't know, but he had a bleeding ulcer. And the bleeding ulcer was causing him to go into bad blood shock. And that was also taking a toll on his heart, which had dropped down to just one open artery running at about 20%. But we pulled him through a couple of nights there, came up the next morning and walked into the place at 9:30 in the ICU. He's up, he's eating, he's happy, they just found the ulcer, it's no longer bleeding. Now they can try to work on the heart a little bit. The cardiologist is now the treating doctor. And we had a wonderful talk, and he said one interesting thing to me, and if you knew Marty, Marty didn't like to be touched. Marty was opposed to being touched. He never hugged until Judy taught him how to hug. And he never wanted to, be real close to people. And I mean, maybe there were some people, but I never met one. And he said to me that morning when I was talking to him, he said, the nurse held my hand last night when I was going through the roughest part of this. And I really liked that. So it takes till his dying day to admit that he liked to be touched. But again, that's the unique person who's Martin. So I think it's an interesting tribute for all the wonderful people that are here today, the family, the friends, the people who knew Marty in different ways. Our objective here today, as I said before, our objective is to hear what you all have to say about Marty. The booklet that you were given is just a booklet of some people's recollections, some people's reminiscence, some people's thoughts about Marty. And all of us had our own view of him, and that's a wonderful thing. But today, we're going to try to supplement that. After all, Marty died at the age of 76. And, a lot of his contemporaries were even older than him. So the reality for him was a lot of folks just can't make the trip. Particularly wonderful piece from Doug Finney, Marty's long-term friend from Manhattan. Doug's unable to travel at the moment. Clay Wilson, who's in Hawaii, wrote a really interesting novel. But you'll get a kick out of it. It'll give you ideas. And remember, we all look at other people through our own eyes. And so we all color what we see in people. And that's good, because more normally you're not doing that out of anything other than just a love to try to understand who the people are.
My name is Monique Bouzarte, and I'm one of Martin Stefflere's nieces. Our mother, my twin sister Danielle here, our mother was Marty's twin sister. And before I begin on the part that Greg asked me to address, which is the years that we got to know Marty the best is when he came up to Northern California and, of all things, managed a pizzeria that turned into something else. I wanted to thank Greg and Judy for your care and your loving of Marty all these years. He was, the kindnesses they showed to Marty are so great. And teaching Marty how to hug, giving him a home, these are all things that were new to Marty in a way. And I just wanted to thank you. Greg was Marty's cousin, their fathers were brothers. And all the years that Marty was bi-coastal, Greg referred to this, Marty was kind of a permanent house guest out here for 30 years, kind of. He had his own room in their house. Greg was Marty's geographically closest relative. And when Marty had the heart bypass about 5 years ago, when Marty had the angioplasty about a year ago, when Marty went into the hospital this last time, Greg and Judy were there. And in fact, Greg, as he mentioned, was there in his last days. And I will be forever grateful for that. And I am especially grateful, Greg, that you were able to do that hard task of honoring Marty's last wishes, which is not to be resuscitated. And that's a hard thing for anyone to do. It's a really hard thing, and I'm just so grateful that you could honor that, Greg. Thank you for us. So, moving on, few here today may know that in addition to Marty's programming and being a lighting designer and doing market research, he was also a manager of a restaurant. And this was a restaurant that when our mother and her husband moved up to Davis from Southern California, they became friends with next-door neighbors. And their next-door neighbors were into real estate, and pretty soon, Mother and Howard and the Dowlings just became silent partners in a pizzeria that had opened up in a brand new shopping center at the very north part of Davis as it was expanding. And Marty, my grandparents, we had moved up there, I was going to say probably around 1970, and our grandparents, mother's parents, had followed up after that. And about a year after they came up, when going through Marty's things and clearing out his condo, I found a letter from our grandfather, from Red Stefflre, special delivery, remember those days? And it was from December 5th, 1975, and Red wrote that, quote, "I think Angela's has a tremendous potential and will give you a challenge that will keep you involved completely and that you will succeed beyond expectations. Your mother and I back you 110%. And so, our Uncle Marty moved up from Laguna Beach up to Davis. And he became a manager of this pizzeria. Well, within a year, it had seated like 25 people. Within a year, there was an expansion, and there was an outdoor patio area. The seating doubled. Within 2 years after that, it had quadrupled. It had expanded to having a champagne brunch. The menu went way, way, way beyond. He had introduced the first wheat pizza crust back in the mid-1970s. There was even a special thing, the Mexican pizza, that had refried beans on the bottom, and you built up from that. And it became eventually the Angeles people left, and our family bought out the restaurant, and Marty was still the manager. My grandmother did the books. My grandfather came and took the money home each night. All of us kids were put to work too. The younger ones folded pizza boxes as, where's Katie? There's Katie. Her mother remembers it was a penny a box and a penny in food. The older ones of us, we got to work as waitresses, lucky us. I wanted to be a cook, but Marty refused to have women in the kitchen. He felt it was disruptive. And I never quite forgave him for that. At any rate, it developed into being this, a restaurant, not a pizzeria any longer. Our stepfather was a university professor. He was the maitre d' for the champagne brunch on Sundays. Pretty soon I got to leave being a waitress and play recorder duets, and that was much better. And by throughout this time, Marty helped so many young people that worked in the restaurant. He helped put people on their feet. He helped change their lives. He helped give them a vision of doing more, because they were there, working as cooks, working as busboys, working as waitresses. But he did something to each one of those people, and his belief in them allowed them to become so much more. And I'm just, it's kind of, our picture of Marty and our legacy of Marty. Not surprisingly, if anyone's been in the restaurant business, after about 5 years, he burned out. And he went back to he left being a manager, the restaurant got sold, and he went back to doing market research and consulting. And so I know that there will be people speaking before and after, but for those of us nieces and nephews and great nieces, the Marty we knew was in those years, because the Marty that you're talking about is the generation above us.
Shifting gears a little bit, there are many cities have played a role in Marty's life. El Segundo, of course, where he came from. Davis, in the area surrounding Davis, where he worked at Angela's, where his parents lived. Manhattan, of course, is his favorite city in the world. I mean, you'll read some really touching thoughts about Manhattan in Doug Finney's remarks in the memory handbook. You read some from Monique about how they kept pondering around Manhattan on foot, trying to find the world's greatest hamburger. And I think they found it. Marty was the first one I ever heard that found Wagyu, long before Wagyu was on everybody's menu and at Albertsons. So quite interesting. There's another interesting part of Marty's life, and it was after the marketing company had moved to Laguna Beach. And he had a dear friend that started at the marketing company, Barbara Burnett. And Barbara has passed on now, but she created a wonderful business called Hooker Earrings. Yes, Sharon, yes. No, not that Sharon, the other kind. So she created this wonderful business that the Sawdust Festival started, I guess, as just a craftswoman, and then moved along and turned it into a real business. And as always, Marty was her computer guy, and he built her website. We housed it for a while at Rail Delivery, and that was a wonderful friendship. And if there were two people that were close together, I think Barbara could clearly be Marty's closest friend. And so Alex is here. Alex was when Barbara passed, Alex took over the business.
My name is Alejandra, and I worked for Barbara Burnett for 29 years. And Barbara didn't really have any member of her family in California, so people working for her were her family. But there is one person that stands out, and she absolutely loved him like a brother, and that was Marty. So the reason why I'm here, and I just met, family members of Marty. Today I had never seen you before, and what made me come here was just that deep love they had for each other, and Barbara's admiration for Marty. They worked together doing market research, and yes, they really took care of each other, and Marty was the guy to go to when Barbara needed serious advice. And the last 4 years, when Barbara was alive, she had Alzheimer's. And Marty became my person to go to, because if I needed anything, if I needed him to deliver some news to Barbara, I knew that he could be the only person that Barbara would listen to. So he was very good to Barbara. He was very good to me in very tough times. And that's the reason why I'm here, just to pay my respect. Thank you.
Frank Stefflre, who is the second Stefflre, and Vorley, who is mine, was the baby. And during the war, they bought property in Ramona on Black Oak Canyon Road. I can find it. We can get in a car, and I can drive, and I can go up the hill, and I can say, this is where it should be. But what's there now is a water something or other on the right, and the Boy Scout camp that's supposed to say F.H. Stefflre, I didn't see the signs for, so I was just... No, I've learned that. Anyway, during the Second World War, because some of you are too young, during the Second World War, my father, who lived in Inglewood, would drive to Ramona with us, 2 and 3 kids, and they would work on the ranch to grow wheat, but they raised chickens and turkeys, which Greg didn't know because he's the baby of all of us. So he just learned this, and they would dress the turkeys over the weekend, and my father would bring them home. None of us kids ever knew that until quite a bit later. Bring them home packed in ice, and he would sell them to the worker people that he worked with at North American Rockwell, because it was during the war and food was rationed. So he probably was everybody's good friend because they could find turkey, fresh turkeys.
It's worth remembering where the name Volney comes from. Teutonic, it's voice of the people. It's speaker of the village. So to have all of the Volneys coming from, their parents as publishers or political activists is keeping with the name. One of the places that Marty spent a fair amount of time that he loved very much, because it reminded him of Laguna, was South Africa. And in Africa, sometimes about a special person, you'll say, they're this long, this wide, and this color. They're this long, this wide, and this color. And go on like that 3 or 4 times. And what you're saying is they have many beautiful facets. So it's a very strong compliment from a place that has as its main business diamonds, right? You're calling someone a diamond because they have all these facets. You think you know them because you've seen this facet. In reality, Marty is a very complicated man. Marty has many aspects. Okay? Marty would self-describe himself as a control freak, neat freak, little distant, stubborn, all these things, right? You guys are smiling. You've heard this. Okay? And with sincerity. On the other hand, underneath that, he had certain philosophies. One philosophy was, why not? Okay? Why not? And if you think about all of you in this room and other people he's touched, I bet a good chunk of the time it was from the why not. You'd bring up something and you'd be concerned. Well, you've said what the answer is, well, why not? Why not do it? Okay? So he had this sense of why not. And I think he touched a lot of people with the why not. The one thing I did try to capture in my write-up from his time of partnership with my father, and the partnership with my father is a very difficult thing. Red, that special delivery letter from Red surprised me a lot. Red was not a man who gave compliments to his children. Okay? And that was hard for Marty. It was hard for my father. My father was not the easiest person to go into partnership with. And essentially, Stefflre Associates, all of this marketing stuff that went from about 1965 to around 1985 off and on, was partnership between Marty and my father. And what comes across there is family loyalty, even if you hate each other's guts in the moment, right? And so he really considered family important. He considered every human being important. He asked why not. A lot of the stuff done in Laguna is what's hot today. You hear data scientists, people want data scientists, predictive analytics, all of this stuff. It's now the new thing. Well, that was part of why University of California, Irvine was created in the early 60s. A lot of the computer science came out of there. That's why the business was created in Laguna Beach, was around Irvine, started a little bit around UCLA. All of this started there. So in many ways, Marty was a pioneer data scientist. And the examples I use of some of the questions were, we had Tang. NASA invented Tang. What do you do with this stuff? Why is there Tang? Well, you want orange juice for people going to the moon. So you create a process. General Foods did a process. Freeze-dried coffee. Okay, yeah, you want coffee that doesn't have beans. What are you going to do with beans in a spaceship? Right? Your coffee grounds? So you needed something that had nothing left over, but would be fresh. So General Foods made that. So Stefflre Associates was brought in to figure out, okay, how do we create a product around that? How do we do it where people will buy it? So anybody here who's seen the, what is it called? Mad Men, somebody was telling me about earlier. That was the advertising world of like 50s, 60s. That was the world that Marty was a bit of a pioneer in with my father. Okay? Now, my father was a pure crazy visionary. He saw stuff in data in his gut that may or may not have been there, always a good story, and usually pretty accurate. Marty would figure out how to look at the data, see what's really there, and either say yes, no, or maybe, but then justify it all. For creation of things that matter, good heart matters. And Marty was a good heart for people. I've heard it said, I don't want to take away other people's stories, but there's different people in the family that Marty was always available as a sounding board, right? Somebody to call for his opinion. And he'd never really give the answer, but you'd feel better after the conversation, okay? And that is the perfect thing in that situation. So those are some of my observations about Marty. I dealt with him quite a bit, saw him quite a bit during his time in New York from 2009 on, which wasn't very often, it was maybe 3 or 4 times. And I met a lot of his friends during that period. He had generously allowed me to use his place while I was going through some transition stuff, and I'm very grateful for that. And so I saw different sides in a very small apartment that shows up in some of the photos. My son and I and Marty together at times. But the general goodness and the complexity and the range of people he touched were the feelings that I wanted to convey. The fact that some of the stuff that he did back then is the new exciting stuff now, going back to your straddles constant, very much in future tense, right? In the future. Those are the aspects I take with Marty.
When I first started with rail delivery, the first thing that I found out was that this job that was 10 minutes from home was moving an hour away from my home within a year. And I was very disappointed when I heard that, and I thought, well, I don't know what to do. I'm the one who takes my daughter to and from school every day. And so he talked to partners, and they allowed me very graciously to work from home for the hours before and after my daughter's school hours, and to pick her up, drop her off, pick her up. And that went on for a few years until she graduated from high school. So just he had a very caring heart, and wanted to make sure that we were always taken care of. He encouraged me, and the group that I now have working in our department too, and every new person was somebody that we spent time getting to know. And we would go for lunch once a month. He initiated that, just so we could talk and get to know. And a lot of it was work talk, but we got to know each other personally, even more so. Yeah, built a great team because of Marty.
Thank you, thank you. Let's turn to, there's another part of Marty that's interesting, and we should all just keep remembering it because we don't want this to get too damn maudlin. Marty could be prickly, and as you maybe noticed on the tables when you ate, there's cacti on those tables. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is, of course, that Marty could always be prickly. He could be, he could love you, but he could be easily offended, and he could stomp his foot with the best of them. So when Marty finally decided he'd strike out on his own to buy a piece of property, we knew he was going to be a very difficult client. He hadn't purchased a piece of property in his entire life. He didn't even know what an escrow was. This is a man of great breadth, but didn't have a damn clue as to what an escrow was, or how you bought a house, or who did what. So because we had to protect him, we sent him to Judy's sister, Carol Kawamoto, to do that. And the story I want you to tell briefly is how wonderful it was working with Marty buying the house.
It was wonderful working with Marty buying this house. And Greg is right, he knew nothing about the process, and I pride myself in first-time home buyers that I can explain the process and deal with the best of them. But Marty was a little different. He asked very pointed questions, and most of the time I could give him the answers, and if I couldn't, I always found out what the answers were and got back to him. But what Marty didn't like is when somebody changed the rules on him. For instance, he started out with a $300,000 sale, and said, this is how much money I want to spend. And I got him a lender that was great. I've worked with him forever. And then Marty decided, and he got a good rate, but then Marty decided he didn't want a $300,000 house. He wanted a $90,000 condo. And he thought the interest rate should be the same. Well, I had to tell him that that wasn't quite true. And he didn't like that at all. But what I like about Marty is he could blow up, like Greg said, and get angry and hang up the phone, and then I'd see my phone ringing again, and it's Marty. I said, oh my gosh, I just don't think I can do this again. Pick up the phone, Carol. So I picked up the phone, and all of a sudden he was on to a different subject. His tirade was gone. He was forgiven. He was reasonable. But that's Marty. The one thing I learned when I moved from Illinois to out here is I worked with Marty for a short period of time, and he was always very kind and very sweet and always very inclusive. But when I had a question on computers, we had a communication problem. I don't have the largest vocabulary with computers, so I would use words like thingamajig or hootenanny or something like that popped up on my screen, and he goes, what in God's name is a hootenanny? I said, and this is how we would communicate for about the first year. And then finally, once we were on the same page, more or less, I was on his page, we got into a better communication. But he was a wonderful man, extremely forgiving, very tolerant, and in the end, it turned out to be a very good friend and a lot of fun to work with in retrospect. As we went through this purchase process of his condo, he had said, we wrote everything out, everything was perfect, but then when they moved out, the sellers moved out, there were holes in the wall, and they were not patched. And at that particular time, he goes, well, aren't they going to patch these holes? And I said, well, no. He goes, why not? I said, you didn't ask for it. He goes, I didn't ask for it. You have to ask for that? I said, yes, you do. And I said, so he goes, well, okay. And he was pretty upset about it. About 6 months later, they changed the purchase contract. The California Association of Realtors changed that contract to put that into the contract that said, patch the holes. And I just thought I'd share that because it was, at the time he mentioned it, it was a pain, but then to see that they changed the contract to something for somebody that didn't really know anything about real estate to adhere to what he wanted, I thought was just remarkable.
You'd ask him a tough question, and he'd go, or he'd act like he didn't hear the question. And, 30 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 days, 2 months later, he'd say, okay, here. And he'd show you what he built. And that was Marty. He'd go out, he'd study the problem, he wouldn't say he'd do it. God knows he wouldn't promise you he'd bring it to you. But by God, he'd do it. So when we started Rail Delivery Services back in the day, there were very few hardware suppliers. There were very, we were in that conversion where the personal computer was just coming out, and Rail Delivery was going to run on personal computers for a long time because we couldn't run on the S400 or any of that big machinery. We didn't have the money, we didn't have the talent. So Marty ran across a pair of brothers who had recently immigrated from Vietnam, and I'm pleased to say Taylor Tran's here today. And he and his brother formed their own company, and Marty, for the longest time, was a very loyal friend to these folks. So I think it'd be nice if Taylor said a few words.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm very honored. And I'm happy, wonderful to see all your Marty family for the first time. I knew Marty for 17 years professionally, working with him, days and nights and late hours and all that stuff. So I only share with you professionally what I've done with Marty. For 17 years, not once that Marty ever angry with me, ever so, displeased. A lot of time we work on tinkering. I always remember Marty as a tinkering man. Either in the warehouse somewhere or on the sofa or somewhere, he's always tinkering away with technology. Always finding the best way to solve the current problem. Always moving ahead. Same idea with the why not. Not afraid to try out new things, not afraid to look at new things. One of the things that Marty hated the most is Microsoft. Right? Don't want to have anything with Microsoft and stuff. So he always looking for things that try to avoid that, and I can see why. You know, he just doesn't like the idea of monopoly. Doesn't like the idea like we have to do this all the time. So always trying different things, and that in itself is an idea. And I think to this point, that gives you the idea of like open source, free stuff. You don't have to pay. And now with the web, with the social media, you see all of that. It's free for everyone. Okay. So I think at the beginning, Marty saw that way in advance of everybody. Didn't like the idea of having to pay, have to deal with monopoly, have to do certain thing way. I can do better, cheaper, and better for everybody. So that's one thing I knew about Marty. You know, always tinkering, finding best way. And we kind of get along real well because I'm in the same way. Always tinkering away. You know, we always look at things as there's always room for better. There's always room for improvement. You know, we don't have to go with the status quo. We don't have to go with this. There's always room for getting better and solve the current problem. So that's all I really have to share with you. But thank again for having me.
Guys, everybody's been saying nice things. Now I'm going to tell you the truth. He's a crotchety old fart. Marty and I had more combat conversations. He would say, the deep voice, Sharon, Marty. And you know, every time I said, can we do this? He goes, explain. I go, I'm not geek, I can't explain. But you know, he made me try to explain to him exactly what I needed. In fact, right up until the end, because I'm trying to get scanning done in my warehouse. And you know what? I loved him to death. But I'll tell you, he was a crotchety old fart. I'm telling you. I wanted to get him a Christmas present one time, and I said, what do you want? He said, poppycock. I looked at him, I said, what the hell is poppycock? He said, it's like popcorn with caramel or something on it. I go, seriously? And he goes, and a case of Coke. I go, nice. Oh, and I want t-shirts, but make sure they have pockets. I went, holy crap, this guy is really specific when he wants something, right? But you know what? Marty and I became very close. In fact, Marty was going to move to Palm Springs, which is where I live. And I was going to find him a house. And, well, we'd probably use you to do the closing, but, you know, yeah. Okay, yeah. But you know what? I love Marty. We had more closed-door battles so nobody could hear us because it got pretty raunchy at times, you know. Marty, I can tell you, Marty could use some words, I'm telling you. He and I got some pretty good stuff going there. But he was one hell of a man, I'll tell you. Smart, very smart. And he made me smarter.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was a very restrained Sharon Brooks. All right, so Bree, did you have your hand up? Okay. So this is Brianna, Cindy's daughter. Anywhere you want.
I'm Brianna. I'm Cindy's youngest daughter, Greg's granddaughter. I've known Marty my entire life. Like everyone has said, he used to stay at my grandparents' house, so anytime I'd come over, there he was. Well, not always. You know, the day would go on, and then sometime around 8 or 9, he would show up late, cook something that smelled delicious in the kitchen, then go upstairs and work. And that was pretty much about it. He was probably the smartest guy that I know. He used tons of words that I didn't know, but I did so I think he thought I understood everything. And I was fortunate enough to get to work at Rail for, probably a couple years ago. I got to work there, and I got to work with him, and we had this ongoing tradition. And I was the receptionist, so I would see him drive up, and he'd walk in, and he'd quietly come to my desk with $1, and he'd lean over and he would say, "Can you go get me a Coke?" And he did that probably every single day. And it'll probably be one of the things I miss most about him. So that's all I wanted to say.
It's pretty interesting. I haven't really kept count, but if you look at all these pictures, it's a pretty rare picture that doesn't have Marty have a can of Coke in his hand. He was Coke and cigarettes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Garcia. I'm one of the many distant cousins. Don't even know what number cousin, but I'm one of them. What I just wanted to say is I didn't get to spend a lot of time with Cousin Marty as much as I would have liked. I didn't always get a chance to see him. I didn't get to work at Rail where everyone got to see him all the time. But one thing I did want to mention is just something about his character, and I just wanted to say just how generous and caring he was. I've heard lots of stories about how prickly he was. I never saw that side of him. I always saw this man who went out of his way when I saw him to smile, always talk to me. He always stopped and said, "Oh, hi, Megan, how are you doing?" Even when he wasn't doing his best, he always stopped and he always said hello and just always tried to just have that conversation with me. And it was really nice just to be able to get stopped and just have that conversation, even how stressed I was or anything that was going on. He would just diffuse the situation, calm me down, and just be able to talk. And I remember one instance just going with how generous he was. When I was started at Whittier College, I was talking to him about some computer stuff, and a few days later, he ended up buying me some contraption for my laptop, and I was just blown away. I was just like, did we even talk about this? But it was just, I just wanted to say how generous and how caring he was, and again, I didn't get to spend as much time with him as a lot of other people have, but he will truly be missed. Thank you.
I had very interesting encounters with Marty because, I first started working there, everyone was very welcoming at Railway Delivery Services, and I'm grateful for that. And I was like, wow, these people are really friendly. I was like, no wonder my dad seemed for a period, he liked being at work more than he did at home. I was like, yeah. I'd get home I was so happy, I'd be tired. But I started filling in for him, and then he asked me, he was like, oh, how's it going, son? I'm like, oh, my good. I was like, I'm getting along with this guy named Marty. He's really cool. And he's like, out of all people, he's like, you talking to Marty? And I was like, yeah, he's a really smart guy, And he's like, wow. And I think something we can all relate on towards Marty is how he helped us out of our work life, and it's something that we were going through. And something that really stuck out to me is that when somebody said you would feel better after the conversation, even though he didn't give you, a yes or no answer. It was always in the gray area, And me, at the time, I was, there's a lot of things going on in my life, that a lot of backdoor conversations that we can all say we've had with Marty, that he helped us with, that you almost say wow, he only said a couple of words, but it was the key that I needed to open that door in my life. And that's something that really stuck out to me. And something that I always remember about Marty is whenever you tell him about a tragic story, it may not even be crazy, somebody cut you off on the road, he'd say, oh my goodness. And then I would always laugh because I'd be like, wow, it wasn't even that crazy, but he said, oh my goodness. And then I would always arrive, and I was, caught me drinking a Coke once, and he said, no, don't do that. And I said, what do you mean? Because I would clean up in his office and I would see all the Coke cans and I'd be like, what? What do you mean? And then he's like, no, you're better than that. And he said, don't end up like me. He's like, don't drink Coke. And I was like, all right. And so from that day, I never really was a soda drinker, but I haven't touched soda really since. And that's something, there's so many more stories that I'm sure that'll just hit me throughout the day. But, when I heard of his passing, it really struck out to me because, that was somebody at Railway who genuinely anybody could say, when he asks you how your day is going, it's not just a pass by, how's your day going? Oh, good, and yours. It's nothing like that. It's a genuine, how are you? And you'd really stand there and start talking to him about it, and you kind of catch yourself wow, I'm really telling him about how my day is going, And that's something that, not many people have that ability on you. And for him to reach out to somebody like me, who's, I'm only 21, there's 30-year-olds who don't have that insightful, personality quality about them. And for him to, have that stick out to him through all those years and him travel. I didn't know a lot of these things, that's why I'm very grateful for all of your guys' experiences because I didn't know, he lived in New York. I didn't know all this travel and, he went to Davis and for a while, and it just showed me, I was like, wow, no wonder he knows so much. But yeah, that's why I can appreciate Marty. Thank you.
And the one thing interesting that I've kind of observed today is I've not really heard anybody speak about Marty's sense of humor, which to well, two things that I want to share. One evening, Kat and I were at Judy and Greg's because the four of us love to play Scrabble. Okay. Well, I think Judy was not feeling very well this particular evening, and Marty happened to be in Los Angeles, so we invited him to join and play our game. Well, he skunked us all. And from that point on, we never invited him to play again. Okay? But he would just sit and come up with his word, and it would be maybe 45 points or 65 points, and he'd get this little twinkle in his eye, but never say a word. So another evening, we were there for another match of Scrabble. I had to go to the ladies' room, and I said, Marty, can you take my seat for a minute? Not a problem. I came back. My score was 60 points higher in one round. Okay, so that was one of my favorite memories of Marty, in addition to many others. But there was also another evening, we were at Judy and Greg's for dinner. Marty had just come in on a late flight from New York, and I was in the kitchen rinsing some dishes, and he came over and said hello, and of course I just reached up and hugged him. I'm a hugger like Judy is. And he just he bristled, and I went, what's wrong? Did I offend you? Oh, no. And I said, get over it. And he laughed, okay? But then I said, he told me he had just flown in from New York, and I said, are your arms tired? And he kind of looked at me for a second, and he leaned down and whispered in my ear, and he said, no, I came in on my broomstick. So that is my favorite memory of Marty. God bless him.
I've known Marty my whole life. I didn't see him all the time, but I remember him at his restaurant. I remember him at family reunions. I remember him driving me to Brooks's house for a party, one of many that we went to.
Was I there?
Always.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I was usually handing you beer, so you would like me. He was strange, but so sweet. He listened to show tunes and the oddest songs I've never heard in my whole life. I listened to Beach Boys and other stuff, and he listened to Bette Midler and something about over-the-shoulder boulder holder, and I'm like, what?
No, that was me. That was my house.
No. This was at his car. This was at his car.
In his car?
In his car, driving to a party at your house.
Oh. I
remember because I was in a clown outfit because it was Halloween, and I scared your neighbor's kid. She cried. But from all the times I house sat at my dad's house, we shared a lot of meals together and a lot of talks, and he was just so interesting and so wonderful. And he touched from the youngest of the family to the oldest of the family's heart by just being him. And we will always love Marty. Thank you.
Here, here.
I always thought of Marty as a Renaissance man. And that's kind of an old-fashioned word, but that's kind of how I thought of him. He did stuff that most people would never think of doing. So I remember, and most of this you didn't learn because he told you willingly. This is mostly stuff you had to kind of ferret out. You had to reach in deep and pull and find out. So among many other things Marty did in his life, he earned a commercial pilot's rating. And he flew planes for years until he said, It's now unsafe in the air, and I'm going back to the car. That was it, last time he ever flew, right? He'd fly to Catalina all the time. He'd fly all over the state. Nobody knew he was a pilot except Marty. And to get a commercial license, that's a 4-step process, right? Big process. He did it. Didn't tell anybody. Then he's in Laguna Beach, and he's got a house in Laguna Beach. I don't know exactly when this occurred, but at some point in time, the house got a pool. Now, Marty would never, ever get in a swimming pool that I could ever see him do. But he had this house. And he got pissed off because he had to pay the pool guy to try to keep the algae down, right? Really ranked him. Well, it turns out that he and Volney were working on some weird project for baking soda, using baking soda. So he spent about 3 months reading everything he could read about how to make water pure using only baking soda. No chemicals, none at all. And he called me one day and he says, well, I'm done with this project. I said, what, did you fail? He said, no, I'm coming over. We had a house then in Redondo Beach, had a pool. It's kind of greenish at the time. We used chemicals. So he brought over this stupid little old woman's trolley with 2 big boxes on it full of all kinds of beakers and boxes, but no bottles of chemicals. And he says, go in and have a drink. It was late in the afternoon. I'm known to imbibe at the end of the day. And he said, and then come out in an hour. And so I did. I went out and I came back out and walked to the pool deck. The pool was bright blue. I said, you brought in dye. No, I didn't bring in dye. He said, it could be this way all the time. But, you know, the chemical people, they want to sell chemicals. This is far easier. We got enough baking soda for all of eternity. We can have baking soda, and it won't cost anything. That was Marty. Of the many interesting things he did. The only reason we had a computer was because, to start this company was because he knew this guy, Stuart Ernest, who was a really, I mean, if you ever thought of the word geek, Stuart qualified as a geek in spades. But he was a sweet guy and a kind guy, and he'd been playing around with, designing and building from scratch his own circuit boards. And he built this crazy little CPM machine with 2 discs. The disc on the right had the operating system in it. The disc on the left was the storage. And indeed, we ran rail deliveries on that for almost 4 years until PCs became generally available. That's the other thing with Marty was funny. There's a picture, I don't know if it's running in this frame or not, but there's a picture of our computer room at La Mirada, which was sort of our big home before we built our buildings out in Fontana. And it's like all of these used PCs sitting on shelves, ugly little room, hodgepodge, cables running here or there, about the most disorganized looking mess you could ever ask for. And yet, in the days when it was operating, it was running a $5-6 million business. And I'd say to him, I said, what's that machine? Well, that's a 286 machine. Now, the 286 machine was the earliest of the machines. And it was a slow poke. It couldn't do anything. I said, Marty, we're moving to 486 machines. What are you going to 286? Oh, he says, it's just dandy for the phone calls. He says, we get voicemail in that machine. It's still running. So he hated ever to throw away hardware. And Taylor lived with him, I'm sure. It was an interesting thing. But Marty wasn't really cheap. I call him cheap because I got away with that because we were pretty close. But he was frugal. He was frugal. He figured if he didn't have to spend it, why spend it? He can give it to somebody. And that's why he didn't spend it. He'd eat most of his lunches off coupons. Literally, unless we took him out, and then he thought it was too much. So anyway, we're hitting 4:35. I'm sort of talked out. Anyone else want to say anything before we move it over?
Monique, I just wanted to...
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to add one more thing because, we're humans, and one of the wonderful things about humans is we grow and we change. And so many people have remarked upon Marty's bristliness and his lack of being touched or hugged. And I just wanted people to know that in the last 10 years or so, he had a wonderful friend in Washington, D.C., who was a masseuse. And Marty had regular massages and was touched in the last years of his life, which for those of us that have ever felt a Marty hug is kind of hard to believe, but it was true. And when I, 5 years ago I went to Peru and I did the Inca Trail. And when I got to the hotel at the end, there was, and I checked in, he had emailed and asked for me to have a massage. Now, of course, I've never had a massage. I don't want to be touched. But there was my uncle that was saying you should have a massage. And I emailed him and said, Marty, I don't want a massage. He's been walking on the trail for 5 days. Get a massage. I said, nope, I don't want a massage. But people change and people grow and people soften, and that's part of our lives. And I know that one of the things that Marty would like is for all of us to remember that we can grow and change, be bigger people, be better people, because that's what he was.
Thank you so much for coming and for sharing. Don't feel qualified to speak about Martin Klee. Sounds like a really great guy and really interesting. I just had my Uncle Marty, and Uncle Marty was always just a phone call away, no matter what I needed. Salary negotiations, how to change this light bulb, how to reset the computer, how to do this password, help with my mom. Marty would talk for hours with my mother, Marla, and she would ask him questions for hours and just patiently answer over and over. He always made me feel like I was doing the right thing and I was a good kid and never an inconvenience. And he did that for me and for so many other people in the family. He was this touchstone and this bridge between all the branches. So I'm hopeful now for him, because he's gone, we have to be the bridge together. And so we're going to have to make contact, and I love seeing you all here, and I love hearing your stories. And I think for him, it's really good that we're all in this room. He would love that. Thank you.